Prime Minister's decision over the appointment of every public office, from the President down to the watchman, is virtually unfettered. We have a monarchy, in effect. The electoral system promotes patronage and clientelism, badly need protection for the environment. Corruption arises when there is no justice. There can be no security in the absence of justice. The only glue for Malta in the future will be
It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce Edward Warrington. Edward Warrington is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Economics, Management and Accountancy, otherwise known as FEMA. He lectures in public policy and governance, particularly in relation to regulatory policy and policy implementation. And in a very thought-provoking article on The Times published in October 2017, Professor Warrington spoke about what he called Malta's tribal politics, which by its very nature is antagonistic to the rule of law. And he called for a renewed commitment to citizenship. In a time so close to political elections, I cannot refrain from quoting two key sentences in that article because they resonate very much today. One is, tribal politics becomes a zero-sum game in which the winner takes all. The gains made lawfully or unlawfully by one party are perceived by the other as loss. And the second quote, which is perhaps even more relevant in view of the elections, tribal loyalty deforms democratic political competition and debilitates governing institutions. I give the floor to Professor Warrington.
Good evening, and first of all, thank you for inviting me and thank you for showing up. Before I move into the substance of what I have to say, a brief preamble. Because work has been so central to my life and my involvement in the public life of this country and in the education of the country has been so central to my life, it was useful to review what had happened. It wasn't a conventional evaluation. I did this or that, or didn't do this or didn't do that. What impressed itself most forcefully on my thinking was a series of murders, which hasn't yet ended, which began approximately 6 years ago. The first, you may remember, was a series of car bombings in which several people died. The police at the time said this was probably turf wars related to organized crime. Then came the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. A year later, the murder of Hugo Ketkuti. And how long ago? 2-3 weeks ago, the murder of an innocuous migrant at Halfar in a drive-by shooting. Nobody has been brought to justice in any of these, although an arrests were made, but so far there hasn't been a definitive sentence of guilt or innocence. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what lies behind this. It isn't simply a sign of a weakening of the rule of law, which is a phrase that is constantly being used now. What lies behind it is a struggle for power, in which the new powers of the land are battling for control of the country. And the new powers in the land are, first, organized crime. Secondly, the press, in the broadest sense of the word. Thirdly, business interests. Then there is the fate of the powerless, represented by this young man who was shot some couple of weeks ago. So I say this as a preliminary to the way I propose to address the question of constitutional reform. I'm not going to speak about whether we need to retouch this or bring in that, or whether we ought to look at a different model, a presidential model, which is sometimes mooted, or whether there should be some kind of power-sharing arrangement between the Prime Minister or the President. To me, those are secondary issues. The most important point is, what are the sources of power, and how is that power deployed? Thirdly, what controls are necessary to turn that power into a force for good? Those are the questions that I propose to address. Now let me see if I can get this to work. So, Repubblika put in constitutional reform, question. It's about as bland as you can think of. 30-odd years ago, when I was a young civil servant engaged in a program of governmental reform, a senior man chided me for using the word reform. It wasn't a word that I had chosen, but I had embraced it wholeheartedly. He said to me, reform suggests delinquency, and he was right. When we speak about the Constitution, to speak about constitutional reform suggests a delinquent constitution, when what is perhaps at fault is the delinquency of our collective soul. I prefer to think of constitutional development, and as you will see in a short while, I have good reasons for saying this, not simply because of the future, but because of our past. And mine is the perspective of a political scientist. I'm not a lawyer, and while I appreciate all that lawyers can contribute to debate about the development of our Constitution, and all that they have contributed to the framing of the Constitution, I think there are certain weaknesses in the constitutional order which stem from an excessive input from lawyers. And again, I will explain why. We have very little input from political scientists. We have plenty from politicians, but not political scientists. And I hope, in a very small way, to make a contribution in this regard. So, I like to use images. There is the image of the newest, most contentious public building in the islands, the seat of our sovereignty, the seat of our democracy. A building which is supposed to be futuristic, but which in important ways harks back at our political tradition. The idea of power as a fortress. The obscurity or lack of transparency of power. It's not possible to look into that building. And the third, and this is pure prejudice on my part, because I'm not an architect, so I don't know, is the pretentiousness of the building. But that's me. I'm telling you my credentials. The political scientist's perspective focuses on power, focuses on history, and focuses on ethos. Oops, no, sorry, we've done something naughty. The political scientist views the Constitution as something more than a supreme and solitary law. A first-year undergraduate doing political science would be given that definition of a constitution. But the idea is much more malleable, much more powerful, much deeper. And I propose to you, among the whole range of perspectives today, the idea of covenant. And I will explore that a little bit more. Reform, as I said, implies delinquency. Development implies growth in virtue. And there is a whole tradition in political science that focuses on virtue in public life, beyond any discussion about institutions or remedies or checks and balances. the whole purpose of a constitution is to allow a collective growth in virtue. So my agenda is a set of questions which I cannot hope to exhaust in the time that is available, but which I offer to you simply to stimulate your thinking and perhaps at some point to stimulate genuine public debate about the Constitution. The first set of questions concerns what is the Constitution and how has it developed. This is all about power and about history. Now, a closer look at power. In our constitution, in any constitution, there are sovereigns, the supreme lawmakers. And there are wards, those who are under the guardianship of the constitution. It's necessary to know who those are. It's necessary to know why they are wards of the constitution. And it's necessary also to ask, who is not protected? Then an assessment of how effective is the Constitution, much more than we think. What are its weaknesses? Far fewer than we think, but some of them are very grave indeed. Some of those are now matters of urgent concern. And then lastly, looking ahead. Ought we to speak of constitutional reform or development, and what does this imply? And what would be the next steps in what I consider to be the development of our Constitution? If at any point I'm not clear, I don't mind somebody raising a hand and saying, you're not clear on this. So I'm going to present to you two broad views of what a constitution is. And I'm not talking only about the Maltese Constitution. I'm a comparativist. I speak about constitutions as an idea and as an institution. There is, first of all, the idea of the Constitution as law. The idea that a constitution is a supreme law standing over and above every institution and every other piece of legislation, or a body of rules establishing the government of a state and regulating their interrelationships. This is the oldest idea of what you might call modern constitutions. In this view, a constitution is the legal embodiment of a social contract, a pact, a contract between the rulers and the ruled. It isn't only a question of whether this is democratic or not. Any constitution, including the constitution, the autocratic constitution of Bhutan or the People's Republic of China. The dominant value in the legal view of a constitution is compliance. The law is there to be complied with. The legal view of politics is that it is a competition in a democracy, somewhat Darwinian though, all competitions are. In other words, the fittest wins. The competition is moderated by rules embodied in the Constitution, and the competition is for the control of government. Irbahna al-gvern and there is so much interesting imagery for those like me who are interested in the politics of the political implications of imagery about the way, following an election, that the party and its supporters in any administration assaults and takes over the Auberge de Castille. So just in case you thought I'm exaggerating, the legal understanding of a constitution regards politics as a Darwinian, rules-based competition for control of the government. The legal view would speak of constitutional reform, the correction of delinquency, of the weaknesses, the anomalies in the Constitution. I'm not condemning this view, as you will see in a moment. I'm simply exposing what a political scientist would see in this. There is another view of the Constitution, which is embodied in the constitutional tradition of the United States and in some of the cantonal constitutions of Switzerland. But it's also an idea which is gaining ground. If you look at the scholarly literature, the studies of constitutional development, this idea of covenant is gaining ground. And this is, of course, you might think, a biblical idea. Well, it isn't actually. The idea of covenant developed in the Assyrian Empire. So covenant was originally a political institution, which then acquired the leaven, if you like, of religious tradition, and was, because of that, transmitted into the West. What is a covenant? A covenant is a lasting and free pact between free individuals or groups, which establishes a reciprocal bond of protection and fidelity. And the beauty of a covenant, as opposed to a contract, is that it makes no pretense to equality. The Assyrians developed the notion of covenant as a way of regulating relationships between the center of the empire and the kingdoms which fell broadly within its sphere of influence. So that the idea of either a breakdown in the relationship, which happens with a contract, you can tear it up. A covenant is never torn up. It's renewed or it gradually erodes. But you don't have to go back to the start and redraft as you would with a contract. A covenant is simply revived and reasserted. And, as I said, the ethos is one of reciprocal protection and fidelity. The important thing is the reciprocity of it. A covenant embodies relationship and community before self-interest. The dominant value is mutuality and fidelity. The covenantal view of constitutions regards politics as essentially a collective enterprise in search of the common good and individual flourishing. We, the people of the United States. We, the people. There's no such preamble in most constitutions, and certainly none of that in Malta, Malta's constitution. Which is not to say that there is no covenantal element, but I will come to that in a second. The covenantal view of constitutions speaks of constitutional development in the search of good government and a virtuous freedom, not liberalism, not the freedom to do as I please, not the freedom to work against the collectivity, but a virtuous freedom, which implies relationship and responsibility. Do these two traditions come together at all? They do, in many constitutions, and in Malta's as well. And they come together most perfectly in what is called democratic constitutionalism, which is embodied, written down in various formulas in the first chapter of our Constitution, just in case there are those who think that the Constitution is outdated. Democratic constitutionalism is an admirable synthesis of both the legal and the covenantal traditions. It creates a state which serves the common good. First, by limiting government. Now, this is not the American view of no government, but of limited government. In other words, a government which is not an absolute, total sovereign with power over life and death. The democratic constitutionalism empowers citizens, it empowers communities as well. How? Well, first of all, it liberates citizens, not, as I said, to do as they please, but to be engaged in the building of a common home. I borrowed a phrase there from Pope. The legal or constitutional element in this formula would pay attention to the rule of law, to the autonomy of institutions, to public policy which is equitable in principle from the very start, whereas in common or garden democracies, public policy is essentially driven by self-interest. And the greater the fragmentation of interests, the less is the common good served. Ethical politics. These four elements are a seamless spectrum. You begin with the rule of law, you move on to autonomous institutions, without which the rule of law cannot subsist for the long term. Autonomous institutions, generally speaking, work for public policies that are equitable, that are just. And in turn, equity stimulates ethics. Corruption arises when there is no justice. And of course, it then sets up a vicious circle. So if in principle, public policy doesn't have justice as its lodestar, then you can be damn sure that there will be corruption. Oops, again, sorry. So, with that in view, let's have a quick look at the history of our Constitution, now extending 57 years. Now the historians and the lawyers will quibble over this, but as I said, I'm neither. I am a political scientist, and I stand my ground. The state of Malta came into being with the Blood Constitution in March of 1962. It became a sovereign state in September of 1964. But the Constitution originated then, in March of 1962. So, between 1962 and 1964, the negotiations on the Maltese Constitution eventually bore fruit in the birth of a sovereign state. A sovereign state. But it was a bitterly contested birth. A birth in which one of the parents repudiated the child. The Labour Party had dismissed the Independence Constitution as deeply defective, and perhaps they had good reason for saying that. The next bout of constitution making occurred in 1974, behind the scenes, far from the public eye. That legitimated the Constitution. At last, the two major political parties could both say, this is the Constitution that we have collectively drafted without the oversight of British authorities, and which we both agree on, even if there was still some cause for dissatisfaction. By 1981, a constitutional crisis erupted. It was a constitutional and a political crisis, and it lasted 5 bitter years. And the marvel of this crisis is that the Constitution didn't break down, because there was a will not to allow it to break down. Most other countries which became independent, when Malta became independent, would have experienced something like that, and after 15 days have reverted to military rule. Malta didn't. And that's something to think about. In the run-up to the elections of May of 1987, a frenzy of of constitutional negotiation consolidated the democratic element in the Constitution by enshrining the idea of majority rule, a majority of votes and a plurality of seats in Parliament. It also consolidated the duopoly that the two major political parties exercise over the Constitution. And this brings me back to the idea of who are the sovereigns. Between 1992 and 1987, we had the most peaceful, the most productive, the most bipartisan approach to constitutional development. Democratization advanced somewhat, for example, through the institution of local councils, and the scrutiny of the executive, more importantly, was enlarged. During this period, for example, the Ombudsman was created, the Director of Audit and the Department of Audit became the National Audit Office, with a Constitutional Auditor General and Deputy Auditor General. Parliamentary committees came into existence, where before they had been something exceptional. There are now almost a dozen standing committees in Parliament, and far from the scenes, they do superb work on the legislation. This was a happy period. It was the period also when I was proud to be involved in governmental reform, that damn word. The next stage of constitution making is a stage which nobody acknowledges. In 2004, May 2004, when Malta acceded to the European Union, that was a constitutional revolution. Our sovereignty was embedded in another constitutional order, which is very much a work in progress. It was unique. Before, during the British period, for example, under the colonial state, Britain was a stable constitution. And our constitution was a series of experiments, most of which failed. Now the opposite is there. We and every other member state come with long traditions of constitutional development and stability, and the European Union, in which all those member states are embedded, is itself groping towards a supranational constitutional architecture. There has never been a time when the study of constitutions was more exciting, more filled with prospects, more hopeful. Then comes a darker period, and I use the word advisedly. This period, incidentally, in which these murders took place. Between roughly 2013 and the present, but I would also go back a little earlier. Let's say to 2008, when things began to go south in Maltese politics, we experienced constitution making by stealth. The constitution is constantly being changed without the actual text being changed. It's being changed through legislation that has constitutional significance. The Constitution cannot regulate everything. It prescribes the national flag and the Maltese language. But then the actual regulation of those, the official languages, particularly Maltese, and the flag is left to other legislation, statute legislation, and so on and so forth. Elections. The Constitution has important provisions in Chapter 6 concerning elections, but then there is the electoral legislation, a vast body, which is an extension of the Constitution and must be in sympathy with the Constitution. So it started with the idea of commodifying citizenship. Then there was legislation on party funding, on standards of conduct, on human rights, particularly this fetish concerning equality. The adjustment of the franchise, lowering of the age of voting to 16. Public appointments. New practices crept in, and conventions, for those in the know, are an important part of any constitution, unwritten practices, such as, for example, putting MPs in executive roles, not as ministers, which the Constitution permits, but having backbenchers chairing government boards, for example. The wholesale institution of persons of trust as a legitimate category of public officer. And then there are initiatives still in the making. The idea of having some kind of quota to regulate the representation of women, the late president's constitutional initiative, and there are others as well. Constitution making by stealth carries risks. It carries the risk of bringing in, on the sly, and it has happened even before 2013, legislation which is inconsistent with the Constitution. For example, one of them was, it concerns me, a sneaky little law which allowed public officers to stand for election when the Constitution specifically excludes them. This sneaky little law, one single clause, nullifies that and doesn't just violate a provision of the Constitution. It violates a principle of government, the idea that the executive is composed of both political and professional elements. With that history in mind, we can say something about who is sovereign, who are the constitutional sovereigns, who are the masters of the Constitution, who are the wards. To draw an analogy, the Queen is the sovereign of Great Britain, but the master of the British Constitution is Parliament. Specifically, the party holding a majority in the House of Commons. What about the wards, those who are protected specifically by the Constitution? So some years ago, there was a great deal of very valuable, very erudite legal debate about whether the Constitution is supreme or Parliament is supreme. Well, the political scientists looking at the Constitution and studying the text would say that there are three co-sovereigns having different roles, but they share in this sovereignty. The Constitution is a supreme law, but Parliament has a great deal of authority over the Constitution. Voters acting in a referendum on certain constitutional questions can also determine the fate of the Constitution. So we have three co-sovereigns: the Constitution, Parliament, and citizen voters. Who are the masters? The two major political parties, the Partit Laborista and the Partit Naționalista, who between them have made it virtually impossible for any independent force to be represented in the House of Representatives. Since 1971, the only way this has been possible is for MPs to secede from the party whip. Who are the wards of the Constitution? Well, I have a special affection for two of the wards, but as I was preparing the presentation, I thought, there I go, neglecting the most important. For historical reasons, the Constitution of Malta pays special attention, contains safeguards for the public service and for the Roman Catholic faith. What happened there was, and again, this is the political scientists looking at power, between 1921 and 1964, there was a reordering of power, a shift in the balance of power. The two traditional elites, the public service, which ran Malta, and the Roman Catholic Church, which embodied the sense of Maltese nationhood and ran community life by the sound of the church bells, were losing out to the new up-and-coming secular political classes with their democratic expectations, with their grassroots support. in the course of negotiating the independence constitution, the public service, and even more, the Catholic Church, put up a savage rearguard action. The Catholic Church more savage than the public service. Public service was always discreet. The Catholic Church was just a step short of burning heretics in the public square. Thank God for Pope Francis now. That is no longer possible. But also, thanks to Chapter 4 of the Constitution specifically, which protects fundamental rights and freedoms, every person in Malta, not every citizen only, every person in Malta is a ward of the Constitution. Every person in Malta, including undocumented migrants, is entitled to the rights and freedoms enshrined in Chapter 4 and additional legislation. So there we have some idea of both form, constitutional form, as well as constitutional realities. I'm not passing judgment on them, but you know that there are matters which I find to be of grave concern. Let's take another cut, looking at the Constitution. If you open the text, there are how many? 115, I think, articles. There are 11 chapters, one of them anomalously numbered 10A. But all of these can be grouped into 3. 4 chapters, 1, 2, 3, and 4, embody a sort of covenant. Chapter 1 speaks about the Republic and its territories. That includes also the elements of Maltese nationhood. That chapter is filled with tension, and every single clause in it, all 6 of them, has been the subject of bitter controversy. It proposes 2 models that are not quite at ease with each other. The idea of a nation-state, one nation, one state. And also the idea of the state and citizen. Chapter 4 particularly presents the idea of, chapters 3 and 4 present the idea of free citizens. Now, you may have no nation, but the citizens are actually freer if the covenant with the state holds. On the other hand, you may have a nation state in which the nation is not at all free. A good example would be China, which is a nation state. It's not at all free. And there are other examples closer to home that we could speak about. The next chapters, another 4, speak about government. They regulate each of the major governing institutions. And the constitutional method is essentially to prescribe the procedure for appointment. The Constitution says very little about the powers and functions. Parliament shall make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Malta. That's about all that it says about the Parliament's functions. The Cabinet shall have the general direction and control of the government of Malta. Most important executive institution is given this license or check. But then there is a great deal of detail about the methods of appointment. It's the same with the judiciary. Most of the chapter dealing with the judiciary deals with appointments, judicial appointments. This is based on the idea, the model, of a Westminster-style parliamentary democracy. And partly because of that, and partly because of Malta's history as a fortress, this component of the Constitution prioritizes the unity of the state and the stability of government. It's virtually impossible to have either a seriously devolved state with this model embodied in those chapters, or to have the kind of political coalitions that exist in so many European states. The last set of chapters could loosely be described as dealing with public policy and administration, different aspects of them. The idea there is to regulate, to some extent, political discretion over technical administrative matters, finance, etc. But the insulation from political partisanship is weak, and it was designed that way. It was designed that way. There is very little effective oversight over ministerial discretion. So the seeds are there, but they have not been fed, or they have not been allowed to flourish. One that I am intimately familiar with, because I was a commissioner, is the Public Service Commission. And I know, because I have researched the history of the Commission in great depth, that it was designed that way. It is unique in the Commonwealth. Our Public Service Commission, the way it is designed, is unique. And it was designed in a way that gives the appearance of extraordinary independence, but in fact the substance is of an emasculated commission. There's, pardon me, a lawyerly sleight of hand there. So, those are the three broad components of the Constitution. And on the basis of this, we can now begin to look somewhat at the future, beginning with an assessment of our record, our constitutional record. And I have in mind to end by 8:30, so that if there's time for questions, or simply for people to leave. Let's look first at the strengths and the achievements, because as an educator, I know that that is the only thing you can build on. Flaws and weaknesses you can rarely remedy, you can somewhat manage and contain. But strengths you can build on infinitely, and achievements as well. So let's look at that, because that is something that I find exceedingly consoling. For a piddling little country to have not only survived independence and the economic shocks and adjustments that occurred in one of the most turbulent geopolitical zones of the world, the Mediterranean, and to accede as a member of the European Union is a remarkable record. Matchless. How many of the colonies of the British Empire, much larger, much better endowed than we did, survived 55 odd years with our constitutional record? How many of them have had military coups? Fiji, one of the countries that I studied in depth on the ground, as it were, had 4 in a period of less than 20 years. When the founding father moved out of the scene, immediately the military stepped in. We have had crises, but we overcame them. We overcame them in spurts through negotiated compromises. Generally speaking, triggered by crises, but also looking more strategically at perceived needs. And as I said earlier, in my view, the finest period in this way was the period 1992 to 1997. Our Constitution embodies very sound principles of governance. I wish there were time to go into them. But all the phrases that we hear about and read about the rule of law, about democracy, about checks and balances and so on, they're all there. Not merely as written chaff, as dressing, they are there in substance. The essential elements of a constitution are all already embodied in our Constitution. What about those elements which I consider to be ambivalent, and a few which are abject failures? The covenantal elements, those chapters 1 to 4, were weak from the outset, partly because of our colonial history, our history of subjugation, and our comparatively weak national identity. You remember, those of you who are 60 plus, like me, a few of you, will remember My Fair Lady and one of the songs there about the English language. The moment he talks, he makes another Englishman despise him. In Malta, there is that element, jekk intix politi jew le. But there is also the notion of tribal loyalty. Just today, in a very, very harmonious department, I ventured a criticism of a public figure. And the immediate reaction was, dak preġudizzju tiegħek. Gradually, those covenantal elements have been subverted by economic, demographic, and cultural factors. For example, Malta is no longer a nation. This is now a plural society, at least 75 different nationalities resident here. So what is the glue that will hold us together? We need to think hard about that, and I propose an idea. There are demographic changes as well. For example, the shifting proportion between the elderly and the younger elements. This affects voting patterns, for example. This affects perceptions of authority. But above all, there are economic factors. And the building development is merely an emblem of that. There are other things which we need to look at more closely. The second problem is the Prime Minister's virtually unrestrained discretion and unaccountable discretion over appointments to every public office. The Prime Minister's decision over the appointment of every public office, from the President down to the watchman, is virtually unfettered. And forget the Commission for the Administration of Justice, forget the Standing Committee on Public Appointments, forget the Public Service Commission and all the other bodies. The Prime Minister is in fact the heir of the governor, whose discretion was actually more restricted, and even more the heir of the Grand Master. Yep, we have a monarchy in effect. Thirdly, the electoral system promotes patronage and clientelism, because not only does it promote competition between political parties, it promotes competition between candidates from the same party as well. So the incentive to offer that much more to garner the marginal vote, as any economist will tell us, is very great indeed. The checks and balances on the executive are still comparatively weak. More importantly, I think, there are new powers, new fields of governance which are not recognized by the Constitution. For example, the Constitution speaks about public finance. It did so at a time when there was no central bank, John. When there was no central bank, the Ministry of Finance was also the monetary authority. We now have a central bank which is embedded in a European system of central banks and which exercises the decisive authority over our currency. In other words, the key to economic stability and social well-being. None of this is recognized in the Constitution. Certain processes are not regulated at all. We need protection for new, vulnerable groups or elements in our collective life. Much more protection for non-citizens, especially those who are not European citizens. And we badly need protection for the environment. And I'm not talking only about Il-Abru, Tal-Bahriya. Above all, because this is an urban society, one of the most densely populated in the world, we need the protection of our urban fabrics, our urban environment, the places where we live and breathe and work and have our being. And finally, we need a constitution that acknowledges, not in separate legislation, the fact of and the consequences of our membership of the European Union. It needs to be dovetailed the way local government has been dovetailed into the constitutional order. So, I will leave you with 3 questions about the future. If we talk about future constitutional development, we need, first of all, not only to draw up an agenda. It's important to distinguish between what is urgent and requires immediate action and what is strategic, what will be legacy for the future. And finally, and Repubblika has already done this, and if I may say so, done it extremely thoughtfully and well, we need to think hard about the process or processes which would most likely, there is nothing certain in politics, most likely secure the legitimacy, the popular legitimacy of the Constitution, an attachment to the Constitution and its effectiveness. Because in the absence of nationhood, the only common bond between us is citizenship and the Constitution. So, the urgent, in my view, concerns appointments to public offices and the standards of conduct expected of office holders. And the third is a question of security and justice, especially security for the state in the first place. Those murders have told us something about the vulnerability, not only of the people killed and the groups that they represent, but about the vulnerability of the state. We may not have to fear too much the kind of events that occurred in New Zealand or the kind of event that occurred in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, but there are other things to fear. And justice, and there can be no security in the absence of justice. These two go hand in hand. And the strategic, in my view, the only glue for Malta in the future will be a revived notion of citizenship. Not one based on ethnicity, nor based on economic stake or wealth, nor based on any kind of social status, but one based on virtue, freedom, virtuous freedom, and engagement in public affairs. The Roman idea, the Roman Republican idea of citizenship. The citizen who had the right and the duty to bear arms in defense of the Republic. The second thing which we need to think of, not for the gray-haired people like myself, but for the younger people here and their successors, is the protection of the commons. Not just the environment, the commons. What is common to all of us? What gives us identity, life, belonging, meaning, purpose? For example, the debate about whether or not the Constitution should recognize a faith or no faith is a question concerning the commons. Virtually everybody here in Malta, I mean, belongs to a faith, even the humanists, though they deny it, with all due respect to them, but they're busily building a new kind of faith. So everybody has this dimension. To have a constitution which does not recognize this dimension of human existence would be a serious omission. Besides the environment and so many other things, public lands, for example. And the third is economic governance. And by that, I have two things in mind. The first is that that neither our legislation, to the best of my knowledge, still less our constitution, recognize the social responsibility of economic activity, the social dimension of economic activity. Nothing can survive without trade, without manufacture. But everything can be lost because of it. And the story of Midas tells us that. Midas. The other is the governance of those critical economic activities, like the currency, which, taking a political science view of the Constitution, are part of the constitutional order. To me, the central bank is, as the monetary authority, is part of the constitutional order. Even though it's not mentioned in the Constitution, it is at least as important as the Ministry of Finance, which is mentioned in the Constitution. That's my agenda. I'm not going to speak about process because the Repubblika has already done that, and as I said, hats off to you for a job very well done. If you have any questions or challenges, I'd be happy to listen to them.
Are there any questions?
Edward, I can't speak on behalf of the central bank, so I'm not going to reply, but anyway, we are part of the supranational part of the Constitution now. But I wanted to raise an issue which touches to the fact of citizenship. The fact that the foreign-born population has increased so fast, in my mind, creates a kind of constitutional danger in terms of transience. We have a large segment of the population that really has no roots here, and comes and goes and comes again. How do you see this in terms of constitutional development?
It's true that there is a large element of transience, but there is a large element of people who are settled here. Perhaps the people whom many of us would not like to have settled here. And we have so many instances of countries near and far where migrants who were disenfranchised and unassimilated for the long term eventually rebelled. Or if they themselves did not succeed in overthrowing the constitutional order, their mere presence and existence gave rise to stresses which very nearly destroyed it. The American Civil War, which was both a contest over slavery as well as about states' rights. So it wasn't just slavery, but it was there. On the other hand, the English Constitution was wise enough, actually, to begin a process of constitutional development precisely with the emancipation of slaves in the 1820s. So, the lesson here, looking at these two countries, you can either dig in, right, and hope that the problem will go away, or that they can be suppressed forever and emarginated forever. Or you can say, this is an opportunity for us to incorporate virtuously into the body politic people who would otherwise be radicalized.
Hello. Oh, yes. Here we go.
At a certain point, you mentioned that it seems like the previous powers and authorities vested in the governor have been transmitted to the Prime Minister, and actually even somehow seemingly increased. My question at this stage is this. We have lived with this constitution for so many years. We are a country, I don't call it with no disrespect, but we are a community. We are a community that is bursting at the seams with lawyers. How come? Absolutely. We were never conscious of the dire situation. And only now, we seem to be waking up to this surreal situation. To what is it attributed? How come we've been so illiterate in respect of our constitution for so long?
Well, society, politics, institutions, constitutions are dynamic things. They are things that one discovers. 2,000 years after the birth of Christianity, we are still probing it. There's an element of mystery, not of magic, but of deepening, understanding, adapting, intuiting, experiencing, testing, experimenting. Then, sometimes, what at first appears necessary, not innocuous, but necessary, for example, at the birth of the state, this very, very vulnerable state, it was necessary to place a premium on unity and stability. And the tradition was that the head of government should be this principle of unity and stability. But then things changed. The practice of that principle didn't change sufficiently. If anything, as I said, there were pressures, forces at stake which made the problem larger until it reaches a critical point, until people like ourselves become conscious of certain things. So I'm not condemning anybody. The other part of my answer to your question, but we simply can't explore it, is that the political scientist doesn't just view a constitution in covenantal terms. There is the elitist view of a constitution as essentially an arrangement crafted by elites to preserve their power. So all of these are in the weave of the constitution. Tradition, personalities are in, their preferences are involved in this. The important thing is to be always aware of what potentially could be the risks and what is happening, to read the signs of the times, to connect dots which appear disconnected. So, as far as I know, nobody connected the dots that I started with, those murders. I did, and they left a lesson. I may be mistaken in my judgment, but I put it to you for consideration. This is how we grow in understanding. Lawrence?
Presumably, we're talking about changes in the Constitution because we feel there are needs which are not being met by our present Constitution. My question is, should a new Constitution reflect what we are living today, or should we be thinking ahead and coming up with a Constitution that will take us into the future that we may not be even living at the moment? So should the Constitution reflect today, or should it reflect the future?
I think my answer would be these two agendas. The urgent, which is about today, but also has implications for the future. And then the strategic view of the Constitution, looking ahead. Now, in politics, you can never look too far ahead because, as they say, a week is a long time in politics. Things can change fundamentally. When the Brazilians devised their constitution in the late 80s after the end of military rule, they tried to cater for just about everything. Look at them now. They created a constitution so filled with detail that it was not workable, and it therefore loses credibility. And then it begins to be subverted. So we need to look ahead. We need to think strategically. We need to think about the legacy that we are going to leave for future generations. Not only, as I said, the legacy of the Abru and our old buildings in Slima and elsewhere, but also the legacy of power and institutions that we leave behind, to the best of our ability, as far as we can discern. I hope that answers. It's a very personal answer to the question, and not by any means infallible, but this is what I would advise. And if I may, I would never use the word a new constitution, because it's taken us 55 years to learn slowly, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so, how to operate what we have. And as I said, it served us well. So if we go back to the drawing board, do we risk losing all of that accumulated experience of working the Constitution to create what?
Edward, thank you very much. I was struck by your emphasis on virtue, like the moral imperative of the Constitution. And I was struck by the way you did not mention checks and balances as much as I thought you would. I thought that you would put much more emphasis on checks and balances. And I'm wondering, and I'm sharing this thought with you for your reflection, for your feedback. I'm wondering whether this really shows two different ways of looking at human nature. One which is inherently expecting people to rise to their best nature, and the other one which expects people to be inherently selfish, essentially. I'm wondering, in the context of even the article that you mentioned in the beginning, your description of the amoral familism, which is a constituent part of our reality, whether we should come to a state of realization that this is not something that we can wish away. It is not something which we can try to rub out. It is not something which we can simply designate as the other in terms of social class, in terms of political otherness, etc., etc., etc. But that it is ingrained in us, as some people have to accept that they are short, other people have to accept that they are fat. You know? So in that context, isn't it wiser and more realistic to speak about checks and balances as an integral part of a mechanism, of a constitutional mechanism?
Yes, Sandro. But as I said, I tried to avoid too much emphasis on the phrases that everybody speaks about without looking at the underlying vision. Now, going back half a dozen slides, I spoke of democratic constitutionalism, which draws together virtue with accountability, both. Not either or, but both and. So, because we have not spoken about virtue, the Constitution as something that helps to promote virtue, I emphasized it. Of course, we could, yes. And there, not only lawyers, who will have a lot of very useful input to give, but also administrators and politicians will have a lot to offer in terms of designing checks and balances. But ought we not also to look at the whole purpose of checks and balances? Otherwise, we risk, if I may use a religious reference again, we may risk what happened to the people of God in the Old Testament. The covenant became purely and simply a code of law in which, in those days, they didn't tick boxes. They looked at the phylacteries and the color of their clothing and whether they had washed their hands before dinner, etc. It becomes form over substance. The form becomes the substance instead of the form aiding the realization of substance. So I simply tried to correct what I consider to be a somewhat misplaced emphasis. But once again, I'm not by any means infallible. I offered you an alternative view of some issues concerning the Constitution.
I can project, I think you can hear me. Thank you, excellent lecture. I had a comment that I thought I'd add, because we've talked quite a bit about adding things to that have not been addressed yet and haven't been in the Constitution so far, but there's also a great issue with not implementing things that are already there. So to give one example, because we're in election period, Article 57 of the Constitution says that residents are entitled to vote, and those who study or work abroad are still considered and interpreted by the courts as habitually resident in Malta, and so should be entitled to vote. But because of the way the system is enacted, people cannot vote from abroad. You have to be physically present, so we automatically disenfranchise voters, and yet on both sides of the political spectrum there hasn't been sufficient effort to remedy this, even though technology and so on is in place at the moment. So we also have to think about, in terms of this virtuous leadership, how to go out ensuring the factors in the Constitution are also implemented, and not just when it's serving the needs of one side of the political spectrum. So I thought I'd get your comment on that. And as part of that, leading on from that, because I mentioned kind of technology and these things being available, I thought I'd get your opinion on how these developments in technology and so forth would impact on implementing these things in the Constitution and changes in the future. So kind of a subsidiary, maybe a broad,
I'm not the man to answer that.
question, yeah.
I can barely, as you saw, manipulate
Maybe the idea of implementing things that are there already, rather than, there's a lot that we still have to cater for, but things that are there already aren't being seen to because of personal
absolutely.
interests.
I'd like to connect, if I may, a phrase you used with a phrase Sandro used. We need to be realistic. We are living in an age of extraordinary potential, but also an age in which political cultures across the board, are deteriorating because they are more and more aligned to narrower and narrower interests, agendas, and a world in which there is a leadership vacuum. So this is a risk, which is why, for example, I have real reservations about the idea of a constitutional convention, because I know that that would be hijacked. We have had 2 constitutional conventions in the late 1919s, the National Assembly, and then again just after the Second World War. They didn't produce a workable constitution. In the end, it was the political wheeling and dealing with the British government and between the political leaders. So, yes, we have to be very careful before we say, I have the magic formula. Let's understand power, how it is mobilized, its sources, its manifestations, its risks, and its potential benefits. Let's understand first what we would like out of our state, and then see how power can be harnessed to serve this purpose, without jettisoning all that has come to us as fine legacy from the past. Despite the politicization of the civil service, of not only the top ranks, but there are tens of thousands of public officials who are impartial, who are efficient, who have been promoted on merit, who have the public good at heart. To tar them all with the same brush, because there are how many hundreds of persons of trust, of whom a few dozen are disreputable, behave disreputably, I think would be mistaken. Here too we need realism, not to inflate problems, because then we will be caught in a cycle of hopelessness.
I think we also have to learn from other countries. If we take, for example, the fact of allowing people abroad to vote. In Tunisia, when they reconsidered the constitution, I mean, when after the revolution, there was a vote, all right? One of the things was that the people abroad also had to vote. Consequently, the French voters, the Tunisian voters in France voted in the only party that the Tunisians in Tunisia did not want, which was Ennahda. And therefore, especially with the fact that we have a huge immigrant population in Australia, etc., which is also claiming citizenship, apart from all the citizens who are now Maltese citizens and have bought their passports, and who therefore would have a right to vote, you have to be careful when you start saying, let people who live abroad vote. I was an ambassador, and I know what the population was both in France, the Maltese population in France, and the Maltese population in Tunisia. And I have seen the problems of voting from abroad, what problems it has created for Italy, for France, but France has its dom-tom, which is different, you know, the domaine outre-mer, etc. And I've seen it really at work in Tunisia. So
I just wanted to point out that I was making a distinction. I'm not saying all the diaspora community should vote. I specifically referred
if they
to
are Maltese citizens, and you give that vote, they have all the right to vote. And you have to keep that in mind. Once you create that, you cannot make a distinction.
Again, I'm not saying we added and we created. I'm saying what's already in the Constitution, that if you are habitually resident abroad, you are constitutionally allowed to vote, but because of the practicalities of the way the voting system is, that you have to be personally, physically present.
Yes, but habitually, it requires a lot of definition. You know, what is habitual? And you can play a lot with that. I think it's a very dangerous move myself.
But people at the back would like to hear you.
This will be the last question.
You talked about debate over the Constitution and so on. Are we going to be allowed to debate the Constitution with the present government going the way it is, taking over institutions, taking over judiciary, executive, etc.? We do not have separation of these. And therefore, are we going to be allowed to have any say in this new Constitution, or are they going to hijack it and just have what they want?
There is a very real risk of hijack, because that is the tradition. To hijack is perhaps an overly dramatic. But the masters of the Constitution for the last half century have been the political parties, actually a century, going back to 1919. So there is that risk. And because they hold the power, they're not going to release it. Which is why associations like Repubblika are important, which is why new political parties are important, which is why scholars are important as well. And one of the things that pleased me about your memorandum on the process of constitutional reform was that all of these realities were acknowledged. Now, we can either say this will be an unsatisfactory compromise, everybody clawing in some kind of role. Or we can say we will engage in good faith and do our best. We will not create the perfect constitution, but we will continue to improve it, to help it grow, to help us collectively to grow in this virtuous freedom. But we have to be brave.